Hello, everyone. All right, we're getting back right to it here. So, last couple lectures we talked about Mesopotamia, we talked about Egypt, right? And we're going to get into a very important topic in early civilization, specifically the ancient Hebrews. This is an image of what's called the Wailing Wall. I'll explain this image a little bit later. But before I get to the ancient Hebrews, there is one other early civilization that I want to mention. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. It's called the Hittites, and I just have one slide on the Hittites, and then the rest of this lecture is going to be on the ancient Hebrews, which I think a lot of people find pretty interesting. And as you're going to see when we talk about the Hebrews, a very important civilization as well, all the way to our world today. So I'll get into the Hebrews and explain all this, but first of all, I want to just briefly talk about the Hittites here. So let me go to our first slide. And this is a few key words for the Hittites that you might want to know or do want to know. You want to write these down, and you can kind of just write these down as I'm talking to you about them here. And so the Hittites, when we look at our map here, this is a slightly different map than what we've used before. We started here in Mesopotamia where we learned about the Sumerians and the early civilizations there. We spent a bit of time on ancient Egypt, right? And then over here in this landmass that's called Asia Minor or Anatolia, on this map it's called Anatolia. Sometimes we call it Asia Minor. If you're not familiar, this is where a lot of modern day Turkey is today, for example, the country of modern day Turkey. They'll develop another early civilization known as the Hittites. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, just a few quick notes I want you to know about them. Just so you're familiar, because a lot of people have never even heard about them, but there's a civilization that was around for a couple thousand years. We tend to break it up into like an early Hittite period and a later Hittite period. We don't have that much information until about 1700 BC. The Hittite kingdom seems to be pretty small. From 1700 to 1200 BC, they seem to be more powerful and more developed. We have Hittite law codes if you want. You can go and read translations of, learn a little bit more about them. But essentially, what I want you to know is that they were a monarchy, that they are going to expand. Where you see on this map here, this blob of green is where they kind of center, but if you can kind of see this dashed green area, everything in this dashed green area is essentially where it says here the extent of Hittite influence. So you can see they become fairly large in terms of geographical land masses. So they take control of a lot of area. And we know that they were a strong warrior society as well. Another kind of quick little thing you can note about them. And if you look at the map, and I always say you don't need to memorize dates, but it's good to have chronology in terms of what's going on. The period between about 1700 and 1200 BC, right? Around that same time period, Egypt is kind of starting to move into its empire kingdom. And if you look at the map here, everything in red on this map that I'm circling, that's Egypt, if you remember, in the Empire Kingdom. Now, if you look at it carefully, what you start to notice during these years of about 15, 14, 13, 1200 BC, there's an overlap between the Hittites and the Egyptians. And that's right in this region over here that I'm kind of shading in here, just coloring in with a little bit of red, which of course I'm going to just erase again. But just that area there, right? They overlap. And not a surprise, this leads to a battle or a war. So one of the other things I do want you to know about the Hittites is what is called the Battle or War of Kadesh. And it's spelled a couple different ways, so I put a couple different spellings. And again, you don't need to memorize the exact date. I just put circa 1275. But do know it's during the Empire Kingdom and when the Hittites are expanding. And it is during the time when that very strong Ramses II, who I mentioned before in my Egyptian lecture, was a powerful Egyptian pharaoh. And there's this battle between them. And it's interesting because when you look at some sources we have, Ramses claims he was victorious and defeated the Hittites in this battle. What's interesting, however, is there's a treaty that follows the battle, and when you look at the treaty, it doesn't seem that the Egyptians won. We also have an account I read once that after the war, Ramses II personally beheaded his own generals who were part of the battle. And you generally don't behead generals who win you battles. That usually doesn't work that way. And so it doesn't seem that the Egyptians had an astounding victory against the Hittites. It seems altogether that this was more of a draw. that both sides gained a little of influence. They kind of had commercial trading rights. They worked together. They both had spheres of influence where they maintained after this battle. And so you say, why does this matter? What does this tell us? Why am I even talking about the Battle of Kadesh? What's significant about it if really it was kind of a draw? Well, again, most of you have heard of ancient Egypt. How many of you have heard of the ancient Hittites? Very few people. Yet we know they managed to fight the mighty Egyptians during their empire kingdom to a draw. So at the very least, it tells us that the Hittites were somewhat powerful and strong of a civilization. Now, what happened to the Hittites? Well, look at their date, 1200 BC. Maybe those same sea people again, right? Remember I talked about that sea people in that dark age around 1200 BC? Well, that 1200 BC hits everywhere around the Mediterranean Sea here. So it may have hit Egypt a bit. It may have also hit the Hittites a bit. What's interesting is when the lights kind of go out with the Hittites, that's kind of it. After 1200 BC, we really don't talk about Hittite civilization anymore. There's this dark age, and after the dark age, a whole new set of civilizations emerges. So, and then we're going to get into this new set of civilizations, starting with the Hebrews here in a minute. So that's all you really need to know about the ancient Hittites, just those few things about them. And just as long as you know those few points, those key words, you're good. All right, so I hope that's clear, and that's really all I want you to know. What I want to focus on, of course, in this lecture is what happens after those dark ages. So let's go to our next map, or first key words here, I should say, and this is kind of the post-dark age period. And in the post-dark age period, there are multiple civilizations that emerge. And I'm going to show a map here to you as well to show all this, but you can get all this down. In this lecture today, we're just going to focus on the Hebrews, and what I put here is the years, and again, you don't need to memorize exact years, just these time periods where each of these civilizations is kind of flourishing. So we're going to talk about the ancient Hebrews, 4 civilizations you can see here, the Assyrians, the Neo-Babylonians, and the Persians. In this lecture, we're just going to talk about the Hebrews. And then what I also have next to each one is their capital, where city they're located in, where their civilization flourished from. And so go ahead, get all this down. I'm going to show it to you again here on a map in a second. But again, you always want to make sure to pause, get all the key words before you move forward. So let me show it to you on a map. So this is a much bigger map than we've been using up to this point. Again, just to give us perspective, here is Mesopotamia, right, where we talked about Egypt, Hittites, and then what happens after the Dark Ages. So this is the post-Dark Age period, and just to kind of show you again, here's Jerusalem. That's what we're going to talk about first, the ancient Hebrews. The other civilization, their capital, Nineveh, the ancient Assyrians. The Neo-Babylonians are going to be capital in Babylon. And then the other civilization is the Persians, capital is Persepolis. The one I'm going to spend the most time on will be the Hebrews. That's going to be in this lecture. I'm going to run through these other ones in our next lecture, so just look forward to those in the next lecture. I just didn't want to put too much in one lecture. All right, so kind of just have an idea of where they are on the map, have a kind of a visual. And what we're going to do is start with the Hebrews, which is their capital is in Jerusalem, in this landmass that I kind of just circled here in the red there. And kind of going to show you another close-up map of this as well as we move forward. So let's get to this. All right, so let's look now at the Hebrews. And, what is the objective? What do I want you to get out of this lecture on the Hebrews? And there's 2 big things I want you to know, and I'll explain the map and the colors and the words and all that in a minute. But let's get through the objectives. Number 1, the first thing I want you to know about the Hebrews is going to be their political history, right? What's the political history and, their rulers and all of that. The second big thing I want you to get out of the Hebrews is the cultural history. Now, when we talk about the cultural history, it's going to tie into one of the big themes we're going to cover all semester. And one of the most important reasons we study the Hebrews, as well as so many of the other civilizations this semester, is what do they give us that still impacts our world today? We cover civilizations that are centuries and centuries old, yet still impact us today. And we're going to see that when we talk about the Hebrews. In fact, in one of your modules, and you have a chart, and in this chart, it's kind of an outline chart, and it simply talks about the contributions of various civilizations to our world today. you want to look at that very carefully, right? You want to make sure you use that. Anytime I mention anything about contributions, take that chart out. It's in this week's module, and you can use it and fill it out. What do we get from the Hebrews, from the Greeks, from the Romans, from other civilizations as we go through this semester? And so that's definitely something you want to pay close attention to, right? So we'll get to that. But the first objective is to understand what's the political history of the Hebrews. And so again, I kind of gave you the dates already, about, 1100. I mean, the Hebrews, the Jewish people, go back before this period. They go as far back as probably about 2000 BC, but we start around 1100 BC, post-Dark Ages, because that's when we have more written sources, more archaeological sources to work with. I've actually been to Israel multiple times. I've been to the archaeological sites, some amazing things. And actually, I should tell you, when I teach my History of the Middle East class, or if anybody's watching this and you want more detail on this, I have lectures in my Middle East playlist that are much more detailed on the Hebrews. I actually do two much longer lectures on this. So that's something you can go and look at as well. If you simply want more detail than what I'm going to give you in this class, you can look at the Middle East survey course that I do, and I give you more detail on that. So that's something you can always go on just on my YouTube channel and find. And so anyways, let's start with these words. When we start with the Hebrews politically, initially the Hebrews were what we call an oligarchy. Now that's a word we're going to see several times this semester. An oligarchy simply means rule of a few. And initially there was not one kingdom. And don't worry about this map on the left here, it just comes together. This map on the right is what we're wanting to look at. And there's these two colors, the green and in, I guess, pink. And the Jewish people were divided into 12 tribes. And those 12 tribes were ruled by a group of people simply known as the judges. So that's when it was an oligarchy. Instead of one person ruling, monarchy means one person ruling, there was an oligarchy, a group of a few judges who ruled over the kingdom, or was an real kingdom, again, over the Jewish people. That goes on until we get to the monarchy stage of the ancient Hebrews. And so as we get to, about the year 1020 BC, roughly, right, a little bit before the year 1000 BC, one man unites these 12 tribes and creates a monarchy. And that was the first king. There's going to be 3 kings of the ancient Hebrews I want you to know, right? So there'll be 3 of them I want to know. You want to know, and again, if you're taking notes, if I say, hey, there are 3 kings of the ancient Hebrews you want to know, make sure you know all 3. Those can be quiz questions or things you need to know for exam, midterm quizzes, whatever. And so the first one is a man named Saul. And Saul, he's the only thing, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Again, my Middle East class, I go more detailed. All you need to know about Saul is he unites the tribes. He unites the 12 tribes, creates a kingdom. About 20 years later, around the year 1000 BC, you have the next king, one of the most famous kings, King David. And King David is known for being a very strong king of the ancient Hebrews. And, one of the things that we seem to have accounts of is that there was a war between the kingdom of the Hebrews and a group of people known as the Philistines. Now, one of the most famous stories of King David, and it shows you how, the significance of the Hebrews, that I'm going to say the story, and everyone's heard of it before, David and Goliath, right? Everyone's heard the story of David and Goliath. What's the story of David and Goliath, and how does it connect to this group of people known as the Philistines, which border them? Well, the story of David and Goliath is Goliath, a giant, and David, a young boy with a slingshot, and he kills Goliath, and, and it's this underdog, and we still use that phrase today, the David and Goliath story, very often in sports analogies. But at the end of the day, David defeats this giant. Now, was there literally a giant he slayed? Well, there's things you write in the Bible and that people take literally, and some of it you take metaphorically. And so perhaps the story of David and Goliath is not David literally slaying a giant, but instead defeating the Philistines, which were a great threat to the Jewish people. And so it may be more of a symbolic story. Now, this gets into some interesting detail. People go, well, this is all stuff in the Old Testament. Can you use it for history? And, what we oftentimes tell students, and again, this is something, if you watch my Middle East lectures, you get into a lot more detail on this. when you do archaeology, you find a lot of archaeology supports the things in the Old Testament. But at the same time, the dates don't always match, and that's a lot more explanation than I want to do for this particular course. But you could go and look that up, and you'll see how sometimes, depending on how you date things, things match to the biblical records. Sometimes they're a bit off, and so that's a whole other discussion. But at the end of the day, it does seem that the Jewish people were definitely there. There's no doubt about that, right? The Jewish people inhabited this land, and David ruled over a significant kingdom during this time. What happened when David died? Well, when David died, he's going to be followed by his son, a man named Solomon. So I'm going to kind of move on to the third king I want you to know. And here's some more key words on Solomon. Now, Solomon, he was known as being the wise king, and the most important, there's a couple things you need to know about him, but the most important thing about Solomon, other than he was the king of the Hebrews, is what he built. And he builds in Jerusalem Solomon's temple. Now, what is Solomon's temple? I'm going to show you images. This is some really dramatic things I'm going to show you here. I'm going to walk you through in a second, but just kind of get the key words down here. Solomon's temple, why was it built? Well, it was built to house, two reasons, as a place of worship, right, to the one God, and as a place to house the Ark of the Covenant. Now, I lecture on this, and I use this I tell the story, if do you know what the Ark of the Covenant is? And a lot of students go, I don't know what the Ark of the Covenant is. And I say, have you ever watched Indiana Jones, right? Because if you ever go watch the original Indiana Jones, right, when they were actually good movies, there's, of course, the first one is about the Ark of the Covenant, which houses the Ten Commandments. So the Ark of the Covenant is what held the Ten Commandments, which was put into Solomon's temple. Now, these other terms, Wailing Wall, Dome of the Rock, let me kind of tell you the bigger story of Solomon's temple, because I think this is one of the most interesting things about studying the ancient Hebrews is Solomon's temple and the story behind it. So I'm going to go through this by showing you a number of images. So let me go, hopefully you have the words down, and I'm going to go through and talk about Solomon's temple in more detail. So this is a model. We don't know what Solomon's temple exactly looked like. It's not there today, and I'll explain. But this is a model you see right here in the center of what Solomon's temple may have looked like. Now, outside of Solomon's temple, there was this big, huge wall. Now, Solomon's temple will be built by Solomon, but then it will be destroyed by other civilizations, the Babylonians specifically, who come in afterwards. So the Babylonians destroy this temple. What do the Jewish people do? In Jerusalem, they build another temple there, same spot. That second temple is going to be destroyed later on by the Romans. Now, when the Romans destroy the second temple, the only thing that you could still see there left is not the temple is gone, but this outer wall here, right, that surrounded the temple. That is what is called the Wailing Wall. Now, the Wailing Wall is massive, but if you go to Israel today and you go to Jerusalem today, can you just walk and see this whole Wailing Wall? And the answer is not exactly, and this is why. Let me show you another image here. First of all, this is the Wailing Wall. So this is, if you go to Israel today, this is the Wailing Wall that you would just walk into Jerusalem and you would see, and this is where it's like the holiest site in Judaism, and this is that's all that's visible of the Wailing Wall, right? It's not that big, it's pretty small. This is why. What you could see in person is only this very tiny edge here that I just put a box around. The rest of the Wailing Wall is all been covered by other buildings, because see, after the Hebrews, the Hebrews, of course, the Jewish people, the indigenous people of this land, other civilizations are going to occupy this land, and as other civilizations occupy this land from the Jewish people, they're going to build stuff, and a lot of it was built right up against the Wailing Wall. So all you could actually see initially is this part of the wall. That's it, not very much. But what archaeologists have done over the last 50, 60, 70, 80 years is very carefully excavated between these more modern buildings, and understand, when I say modern, some of these modern buildings are, centuries and centuries old, and the Wailing Wall, and they very carefully excavated in between. And if you go to Jerusalem, I've had the privilege of doing this, you could actually navigate through this, right? You could take a tour through the ancient Wailing Wall that for centuries and centuries and centuries, human beings could not walk through. And so I've done this. Let me show you what it looks like. This is walking through the ancient Wailing Wall. So this is just something so cool to be able to do, you know. And again, when you know history, you know, if you don't know anything, it's just a wall, what big deal. But if you know how this is so connected to the Jewish people, and you know the long history of it and everything, it has a really, really, really powerful meaning to it. So that's kind of cool. You could actually walk through the whole ancient Wailing Wall. This is just a picture I took when I was there. So I wanted to make sure you could see that. So that was pretty neat. So that's all part of the Wailing Wall that's still standing there today. Then back on the outside, this is just a close-up, and people see papers there. Those are our notes to God, right? So anybody who wants can go. And by the way, anybody can go to the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. You don't have to be Jewish. Jewish, Christians, Muslims, atheists, anybody can go to the Wailing Wall. Jerusalem is an open city to anybody. You can go. Anybody can go there if you want to go and visit. And so, you know, tourists come all over the place. So you have tourist people, religious people there who all go visit the Wailing Wall. So they put notes to God there. All right. And then the question is, what happens after that? Well, let me show you what happens later. This monument, maybe some of you recognize this. This is called the Dome of the Rock, right? So this is called the Dome of the Rock. So initially, where you saw Solomon's temple, after all these different civilizations comes and go, when we get to, you know, we have Judaism, then we have Christianity, then we have the rise of Islam. And when we have the rise of Islam around the 600s AD, some of the Muslim powers, and again, I cover this more in my Middle Eastern history class, build this Islamic mosque right on top of what was Solomon's temple, known as the Dome of the Rock. Now, if you think about, if you know anything about the politics in the area or so forth, do you think this might create a little bit of tension? So basically, right on the spot where you had Solomon's temple, another civilization comes and builds their monument. And so this creates tension all the way until today, because rightfully so, Jewish people, you know, want to go there and pray in this area. But to Muslims, this becomes a sacred site years later. And this sometimes you have situations where they'll go, well, you know, you're not supposed to be here, or you're supposed to be here, or not supposed to be here. And so you get these conflicts of various civilizations and people now claiming this land. To be clear, it was the Jewish people who were there first, and other civilizations built right on top of it. So you can imagine how this can create a bit of havoc and tension in that region. And again, if you take the Middle East class, you get a lot more detail on this. So that's the Dome of the Rock. All right, so what happens after Solomon? So all that's pretty cool. That's some stuff on the Wailing Wall. What happens after Solomon? So after Solomon dies, Solomon was a very strong king, so this is still about the political history. What happens is the kingdom of Israel is going to divide. You have the kingdom of Israel, you can see here in the green, that's in the north, and the kingdom of Judah in the south. And so Solomon dies, and then that was around the 900s. The Assyrians, which we're going to talk about in the next lecture, they're going to conquer the kingdom of Israel in the north. The Babylonians, a little bit later, are going to conquer the kingdom of Judah in the south. Why does that matter? Well, once the kingdom of Israel is conquered by the Assyrians, and make sure you know this, don't confuse this, you can have quiz questions on this, of course, like anything else, and the Babylonians conquered the kingdom of Judah, it will mark the last time the Jewish people have complete self-autonomy over their land. Many people don't realize this until 1948. Now, between this time period, 900, 800, 700, 600 BC, and 1948 AD, there will be Jewish people living in this land. The Jewish people don't just completely disappear, but other civilizations will occupy this land, whether it be the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Ottomans, the British, the Umayyads, the Abbasids before that. so many different civilizations will occupy this land. And it'll take a long time before the Jewish people have autonomy over it again. So, that's, I think, important to know in terms of the long-term issues of this land. And again, that's just the brief version of this. Again, there's a lot more to it if you go into the Middle East lectures. All right. So that's the political history up to, the period of Saul, David, and Solomon. And again, it was around the 900s when, and again, you don't need to memorize exact dates, when the Assyrians are going to conquer the kingdom of Israel. It's going to be closer to about the 600s when the Babylonians are going to conquer the kingdom of Judah. And I'm going to cover that in subsequent lectures. But there's one more really important thing I want you to know about the Hebrews, and that's the cultural aspect of the Hebrews. And what is it about the cultural aspect of the Hebrews that's so important? Well, let's look at our next slide. And it's just a few key words, but they're big ones, right? And it's the biggest thing we get from the Hebrews that still impacts us today. Religion. And not just religion. Religion was around before the Hebrews, right? We have polytheistic gods. What we get from the Hebrews is monotheism. Monotheism meaning one God. And the gods we get, the singular God we get from the Hebrews, the Jewish people, is of course a God that then influences the creation of Christianity and Islam, And so, the Jewish people are small. There's less than 20 million Jewish people in the world today. That's tiny, tiny, tiny. But there are, a couple billion Christians in the world today. There's well over 1.5 billion Muslims in the world today, if you take all the different denominations and stuff. So you don't get Christianity and then you don't get Islam if you don't have Judaism, right? Because they're both based on the same monotheistic God. And this is something that I really spent a lot more time on in the Middle East class. It's going to be really brief here. But essentially, for those of you who are unaware of this, how do we get Christianity from Judaism? Well, in Christianity, in Judaism, you have the idea of a Messiah, a Savior. Guys, Christ was Jewish, right? The Jewish people that believed Christ was the Messiah, the Savior, they became Christians. The Jewish people that said, no, he doesn't meet the characteristics of the Messiah, remain Jews. And so that's essentially how Christianity comes about. Again, there's a lot more detail, but in a nutshell, that's what happens. But if you don't have Judaism, you don't have Christianity. And think of how many people in the world today are influenced by that religion. So when I talk about a contribution, this is what I mean by the contributions. You're looking at nearly half the world's populations today, their belief, their religious beliefs, right? It doesn't matter if you agree, disagree, you believe or not believe, it doesn't matter. It contributes to our world today, right? Based on this small monotheistic religion that the Jewish people developed. That's one. The second really big contribution we get from the Hebrews, and there's a lot more than these two, by the way, I'm only focusing on two, is the non-religious contributions. And, 10 Commandments, right? Everyone's heard of the 10 Commandments. Let's say you're not Jewish. Let's say you're not Christian. Let's say you're an atheist. You don't believe in God at all. You live in the United States of America, but you're an absolute atheist. You don't believe in God, right? Does the Jewish culture impact you today? And the answer is absolutely yes. Because, guys, when our founding fathers created our nation, they didn't just, pull these ideas out of thin air. How did our founding fathers create America? They studied the Bible. They studied the Old Testament. They studied the New Testament. They studied other things as well. They studied the Greeks. They studied the Romans. They studied the Enlightenment. These were individuals who took from a lot of ideas. And if you walk into the Supreme Court, one of the things you see in the Supreme Court are the 10 Commandments. And if you think of some of the 10 Commandments, many of them have to do with our laws today. Maybe you've heard of a term, Judeo-Christian value system, right? What is the Judeo-Christian value system? It's a value system that you see in much of Western civilization that is based on the teachings in the Old and New Testament. And so it does impact us today. It impacts our laws, our way of life, and you don't even realize it very often. But if you really kind of go deeper into it and study it more, it's pretty interesting. One other quick thing on the Ten Commandments. Most people are familiar with a few of them, but there's one commandment that I always mention because there's such a common mistake with it. Many people will say one of the Ten Commandments is thou shalt not kill. That is actually not one of the Ten Commandments. When you read the Ten Commandments in the Hebrew, and I speak Hebrew fluently, I could read it well enough to read some of the words there. And when you read the Ten Commandments, it doesn't say thou shalt not kill. It says don't murder. And you go, okay, why does that matter? It matters a lot. Because are you allowed to murder someone in our legal system today? And the answer is no. Are you allowed to kill someone in our legal system today? And the answer is, depending on the circumstances, yes, right? Somebody breaks into your house and is threatening to kill your family and you kill them, the law protects you, right? But if you go out somewhere and you just murder someone, the law does not protect you. So you're not allowed to murder, right? One of the commandments is thou shalt not murder, not thou shalt not kill. So that's an interesting one. There's other things like it says thou shalt not take God's name in vain. A lot of people think that means don't curse, don't say God damn it. No, that actually means a lot more about, don't do evil in the name of God. That's what that one's about. So there's just a lot more information there, but that's more detailed and nuanced for other courses and other topics. So anyways, the big thing I want you to understand is this contribution we get from the Hebrews. So the religious contribution of monotheism and Christianity and the rise of Islam as well, because if you know anything about the Islamic faith, that's also a monotheistic religion. We cover that as well later on in the semester. But then, just our secular laws, or when I say secular, non-religious laws, they're also influenced by things from the Old Testament. There's a ton of other contributions, but as long as you know those two, you're good. All right, so I hope you found all that interesting on the ancient Hebrews. There's a lot more to that civilization. I could spend hours on it, but it gives you a few things you need to know, plus a little bit on the Hittites. And if you know all that, you're good. And then we're just going to kind of move on and talk about the other civilizations that come after the Hebrews, right, in our various civilizations. So I hope all that's clear. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. And yeah, feel free to check out the other lectures. You can always, most of the people watching this are students. Sometimes there's people watching this. If you want to learn more about them, you can just go and you can always subscribe and watch the other lectures as well if you wanted to. All right, take care. Everyone have a good day. Bye.